First, we're going to hear from Fred Carter, who is based at the University of Edinburgh and working like his research exchange. His host university is the Amsterdam School of Cultural Analysis at the Netherlands. Everyone is going to have around 15 minutes to present, and we are going to follow up with questions after all presentations are over. I wonder though whether, because Fred wants to leave earlier, whether the questions are going to follow directly after your presentation. Okay, so Fred, you can start.
Great, thanks so much. Sorry for that haphazard tech intro and everything. The residency is actually taking place this week. So we've just come off the back of 3 days on Texel Island at the port of Amsterdam, taking 20 artists and researchers, field specialists around by boats, coaches, bicycles, walking, swimming a lot of the time. So I'm a little bit sunburned, I'm a little bit tired. I'm very, very energized about what we're doing. We've all just assembled back at the University of Amsterdam for a couple of study sessions, keynote roundtable tomorrow and a film screening, and we're going to be doing some writing. So what I thought I'd do today is just give a really quick intro to the residency project itself, talk a little bit about some of the methodological commitments that have kind of shaped the program of collective fieldwork this week, but also the way in which they've been shaped by that field as well. And then I wanted to talk just a little bit at the end, run through some slides of just sort of like some of the stuff that we've been getting up to. It's a little bit more fun to show than to tell, I think. So I'll try and rattle through this. But this year's theme has been transitional waters. Hopefully I can give some of a sense of the kind of shifting dynamics of sediment, salinity, shipping infrastructure that have shaped this field that we're dealing with, as well as the kind of modes of situated critical collective inquiry that we've been thinking about this week as a Brackish methodology. So in hydrological terms, estuaries are always transition waters or transitional waters. And at the confluence of various logistical, ecological, and capital flows, the estuary, which is the river that runs out of Amsterdam, and the port that occupies the space at the coast, they both are situated in this kind of ecotonal space where fresh waters are commingling with saline currents, a transitional energy scape that's shaped by alluvial sediments of both economic and metabolic circulation. And so thinking through and across these estuarine environments, field arts, this residency program was kind of conceived as a response to an emerging epistemic and methodological challenge that's posed by fieldwork in the environmental humanities. You know, how can researchers and artists who have no disciplinary training in fieldwork learn with or develop methods that are responsive to the semiotic and material and historical specificity of this concept of the field and its materialities in their thinking or their writing or their practices? So it's an attempt to combine artistic research, political ecology, field philosophy, critical hydrology, further disciplines, taking up the question or the provocation of situated inquiry as a kind of opportunity to undermine or unlearn traditions that delineate or bound a particular field of study. And so in working at the intersection of these various cultural, logistical, hydrological fields that often frustrate epistemic capture, participants at the residency are then invited to take part in developing immersive methods of reading these what we've been thinking about as lived and lively ecologies of the transitional waters of the eye, attempting to turn these apparatuses or these fields of the studio, the lab, the open terrain, to turn them brackish. And I'll come back to what that might mean for us in a minute, but in practical terms, we put together a pretty intensive 5-day program structured around field trips exploring the dune ecologies of Texel, and that's these right here. Which is also the home to the NEOS Sea Research Institute, where we just spent 2 days. And then also the kind of colonial residual infrastructures of the port of Amsterdam at IJmuiden, which is also now the site of the world's largest sea lock expansion, and what will soon be the world's largest offshore wind farm development. This is an image from a work by Natasha Libbert, who's one of our keynote speakers at our closing event tomorrow. And so unfolding over the course of about 5 days, this week, the residency program combines keynote talks by artists and researchers, collaborative study sessions, a 3-day kind of intensive foray into the field that we've just come back from, and then culminates tomorrow in a public-facing film screening and a roundtable event. Yeah, this is the poster for the event tomorrow. And effectively, this is an attempt to build a kind of annual residency or a research infrastructure through which students, scholars, artists can come together and co-create experimental approaches to situated research in the environmental humanities. And this is the basis of the residency. You can find out more about some of the public events program and our participants' projects at the website, which is fieldarts.net. But I want to use the rest of my time to speak a little bit to the material and ecological specificity of this particular field, the flows of tidal waters and maritime logistics that have shaped these waters, and then how these waters in turn have come to shape and inform the kind of modes of inquiry that we're calling brackish methods. So how do the brackish waters of the eye, this confluence of sweet and saline water, estuarine ecologies and port infrastructures, hydrological, logistical flows, how do these sites and materialities demand undisciplined or brackish methods? So I think one place to start for me is with the work of Macarena Gomez-Barris. And in the extractive zone, Gomez-Barris asked this question kind of in another way. She says, how can we confuse the normative boundaries of academic study by wading into what lies below the surface of late capitalism? And to plunge into those waters, she writes, is to insist that thinking through hydrologic relations requires a kind of situated mode of reckoning with the thick opacity of the field. And I think in our encounters with the Eye estuary, with the North Sea, with the tidal mudflats this week, the sort of cross-hatching, if you like, of ecotonal and infrastructural space kind of compels us to think beneath and beyond the field as a kind of bounded site of study or a resource from which knowledge is extracted. And Gomez-Barris kind of describes these embodied or situated modes of inquiry as submerged perspectives, a viewpoint from within rather than from above, in relation to near this kind of thick or opaque water. And I want to suggest that the brackish water that we've been thinking through this week enacts a kind of similar material and methodological reorientation, a kind of amphibian environmentalism from below. So brackish water emerges from the subsurface turbulence of the estuary, right? And the kind of partially submergent mode of thinking that we're calling brackish methods similarly manifests at the troubled and often troubling confluence of disciplinary fields. And we've been thinking through a kind of commitment to open plan fieldwork, cited by the estuary and the port, that's led us to an intersection of infrastructural critique, decolonial hydrofeminism, as in Gomez-Barris's work, and a kind of focus on practice-based methods as well. And for the practice-based research collective World of Matter, opening out the methodologies of fieldwork in the arts and humanities is not, in their terms, about crossing into other territories, but rather identifying the shifting territories and borders that define a field within a play of forces. And so, in other words, it's a methodology that refuses to presume the boundaries of the field before entering that milieu. And so, taking up the shifting boundaries of the estuary as both a field of study and an academic epistemic disposition, thinking brackishly, I think, asks us to reckon with the ways in which an oceanic field that's overwritten by colonial cartography, capitalist shipping infrastructure, can still reorient or rewrite our epistemologies or our practices. And to stay with Gomez-Barris, going beneath this kind of two-dimensional surface of the maritime map or the ethnographic field site, and this is Barris's terms, reveals a differently perceivable world where rivers converge into the flow and muck of life otherwise. But the flows of the eye are multiple, right? They include alluvial sediment, saltwater intrusions, but also the unloading and transshipment of liquid and dry bulk into mainland Europe. And Port of Amsterdam is the largest gas terminal, one of the largest gas terminals in the world. And so if the circulation of maritime capitalism in this form both exploits and disrupts the ecotonal differences of the coastal space, Juliana Sparr and Joshua Clover suggest here, then the brackish waters of the eye, this meeting of land and sea, becomes paradigmatic as what they describe as the meeting point of two ecologies across which value flows. And these flows, I think, are constantly in tension in the space. The accrual of like the river sediment slows the movement of container ships, and it has to be dredged continually, while the expansion of the sea lock in turn disrupts the flow of estuarine circulation, the kind of turbulence under the water that causes salt water to mix with fresh water, producing this biodiverse zone of brackish or transitional waters. And what I'm really, I think interested by here is how this juncture of onshore, offshore infrastructure, this kind of ecotonal space in this field, the unfettered and kind of frictionless circulation of capitalism through shipping, mixing materials, through the exchange value of oil, coal, phosphorus, sand, all of this stuff is kind of like really visibly present on the site. The circulation of these goods requires the disruption of a kind of hydrological exchange produced by sedimentary and saline flows. And so I think that I suppose if I want to leave you guys with anything or a kind of methodological point, is that thinking about brackish methods, responding to a site like this, requires both a situated attention to the specific ecologies of the estuary that's based in a kind of embodied or immersive practice-based method, but also a critique of maritime capitalism that we might take from something like critical infrastructure studies of the logistical turn. And understanding these multiple flows that constitute and contest the field requires a kind of turning our methodologies brackish. I've spoken probably for about 10 minutes, so is that right? I was just going to cycle really quickly.
Yes, you had 5 more minutes if you want to use them. Yeah.
Grand. Yeah, I thought I'd just jump through a couple of images of what we've been up to. We started at NEO's Sea Research Center on Tuesday after a day of study on Monday, and our first keynote talk by Liam Campling and Alejandro Colas, who wrote Capitalism and the Sea. And kind of after a day of really like intense collective thinking, it was really nice just to get out in the field. This is on Texel Island, where they're experimenting with growing seaweed under brackish conditions, changing like the heat and salinity of the water. Esme Geerken, who's a earth scientist and artistic researcher who just did a PhD on NEOS actually, lived on Texel Island for 4 years, took us out taking some sediment samples on the tidal flats. We did a lot of tasting, kind of salty or brackish plant life on the flats. This is sea crowel, or we might think like what's samphire in the UK. And we actually wound up eating a lot and talking about tasting as method, right? Going beyond the kind of like testing towards a kind of fully embodied immersion. Esme gave a keynote, which is kind of, a funny thing for her coming back after living here for a few years and speaking to a really mixed crowd of artists, students, master students who are a part of our program, but also some of the marine biologists, marine chemists that she was working with for the last few years. This is a keynote at NEOS. We did a whole series of lab tours. This is really like mind-blowing and really amazing. It's really cool of these people to give us their time. This is Nicole, who does paleochemistry, so looking at core samples to think about biogeochemical relations mainly in the Pacific, but a little bit in the North Sea as well. She's also really heavily involved in Scientist Rebellion. So he spoke a lot about the kind of the politics of shell funding for this kind of research and the way that scientists are organizing around that. And then at this point, there was a lot of swimming, and we headed pretty sunburned off Texel Island for the port. We got there yesterday, immediately got on a boat. There was a lot of, I think one of the really nice things about what's happened this week is the ways in which people kind of gather and disperse and take off with their very particular practices. Some of the photography that's come out of the last 2 days has been amazing, but also the sound recordings of, we've had a bunch of, and Jeremy, this might be really interesting for you as well, thinking about sort of sound and spatial design. We've had a lot of sound artists who are really interested in how the density and salinity of brackish water affects the way that sound travels, recording the opening and closing of the tidal the sea loch. So yeah, we spent about 3 hours on a research vessel yesterday, going up and down the port. And finally swam last night. I've got an image somewhere here, or maybe I don't, which is a shame. We met a benthic ecologist called Ari Funk, came out and met us at this bar on the beachfront, and was just so completely like blown away and surprised by what we were doing. He wound up giving us a lecture at about like 11 p.m, like standing on a table, whipping out these things out of his pocket and just like drawing on little pieces of paper, trying to explain how the sea lochs are disrupting saline flows. I'm totally at time, so I'm going to stop right there. And thanks for listening.